Good morning. Good morning, Susan.
Good morning. Give me a minute. And there we are. Yay.
How are you?
I am trying to be cool because it's like hot and muggy, and I guess it's going to rain here today, is what they tell me.
I just love you're like Mike's weather page.
Parts
In consolidated. Yeah,
of my life depend on knowing whether or not it's going to rain.
that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
All right. We're not going to be answering. We're going to dig in because this stuff is so important. Um,
Okay.
and I just want to remind everybody that what we ended the last podcast with was Todd recommending that we cease
Who is Todd?
funding. Todd is Todd. I can't think of his last name. Esquire Zolnick, who is Bambi's cohort in this report that they put together after they did their deep dive into our ESE services in Sarasota County. So the $150,000 no bid report that the board prior to Terry's arrival asked for, and then they
Okay,
had
so
recently.
like you're talking to people like they know who these people are.
Well,
So let's back up just a minute.
all right.
So Terry Connor is the new superintendent,
Yes.
and he's been around maybe 6, 7 months at this point in the game.
Oh, I think longer than that. I think almost a year. In fact, I'm going to say his runway is short because he
Okay,
just got a big, long contract and he's been around a while.
so as of November 28th of 23, when this report we're talking about was published or presented, he had been in the district about 90 days. They talk about in the workshop.
Yes, yes, yes.
And so they contracted with a company called Exceptional Learning Solutions, I believe.
Yes.
And there are two presenters that worked with our district, and then they came back and presented to the school board. And it's Todd Zolik, Esquire. He is an attorney and an educator, and Dr. Bambi Locke, and an author. Yes, let's not forget that. And Dr. Bambi Lockman, who has had a variety of jobs in administration of special ed throughout Florida, but most notably, she was the bureau chief at the Florida Department of Education from 2004 to 2011.
And that is the boss lady. She was in charge of everything special education in Florida
at that time. And so just to set the stage for anybody who may have not listened to part one yet, you don't want to miss anything we had to say in part one, so go back and catch up. But that sets the stage for you to know who the players are. And then we have 5 school board members in Sarasota County. Can you name all 5, Sue?
So we have the current chair, who is Karen Rose, who spent her entire career in Sarasota County, up the ranks, principal. She was the director.
Oh, you froze. You're frozen.
Can you hear me?
Well, you're back.
Karen Rose. Did you hear what I said about Karen Rose?
We just heard that she had been a principal.
She had spent her entire career in Sarasota County here. Very proud to say she worked under the Lori White administration many supers ago. She was a principal. Her last position was director of middle schools, which at the time was the superintendent's cabinet. So she was in the nuts and the bolts and the budget and everything Sarasota County. Unless she's had some kind of traumatic brain injury, she knows how budgets used to be. And as a sitting school board member, she's making decisions on the budget currently. And then we have Bridget Ziegler, who's been on the board for many years now, 10 years or so. She's been in the press a lot lately and certainly should understand public records at this point and the budget. And then we have Robin Marinelli, who also was a career educator here in Sarasota County. And her last position was the director of student services, which she was very interested in the student services portion of this report. And then we have Tim Enos, who is also new to the board the last couple of years, but his position in the school district was chief of
Chief of the
SROs, or school police, yeah. But his campaign ran on finance and promising to make he's been on the school board for 4 years. And he reminds people often he's not an educator, but he's a businessman. So he understands.
And I'm just going to recount that was Tom Edwards because you froze for just a minute.
Oh, yeah. And he reminds people often he's not an educator, he's a businessman. And when he was campaigned on the structure of the school board and the business and the, outcomes are important and how you align funding to outcomes is important. So those are the people on our school board, and they've all hired, I think one of them voted no for Terry Connor. I don't remember which one, but they were all in place when the new superintendent was hired.
And it's just important for anybody that's listening to understand the structure of decision making and who is listening to this report out and the level of input and control that they have of the outcomes of what we choose to do or not do and how it impacts students.
Absolutely. And families.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
the reason we went
interrupt.
That's okay. The reason we diverted just a bit was if you could, Susan, pull up, we had a budget workshop in Sarasota County recently where they presented some slides, and I just thought it important to share. We know they've been told, don't use potential money that isn't going to be here next time to fund positions that are critical. So the budget update was, as the slide says, June 18th of 24, so just a few weeks ago. And can you pull up?
I'm trying.
Oh, thanks. Well, that's one of them.
Oh, do you want the other one first?
No.
That's all right. Sorry. Well, I'm quick, so you get the other one first.
So this slide is telling us that they are incorporating the results of the special education study, and there's a dollar amount associated with that. And they're saying that is for the addition of 9 ESE compliance coordinators, which, Susan, we've never had those before, have we?
So we had something called compliance liaisons that were funded at the district level a number of years ago. There was like 4 or 5 of them, and they sort of had schools that they were associated with, and they went around and tried to support the ESE liaisons. So the way we structure things comes and goes in cycles depending on who's in charge at any given time. So we've had, I don't know if it's this exact position, but we have had people who have had a similarly named title.
Right. And fulfilled that role. But what these 2 experts in the field were telling the board was, yes, compliance is important, but academics are where that's keeping your eye on the ball. So you must be compliant while you are focusing on academics. So apparently the way they've chosen to do this is fund these ESE compliance coordinators, and they're going to add extra duty days for ESE program facilitators. And I don't recall that job title. Do you, Susan?
I don't. From what I understand, the 3 that were in the report were compliance liaisons, ESE liaisons, and program specialists. So they were dividing the duties of compliance with the compliance people, and that the program specialist and the ESE liaisons would be helping to support teachers in classrooms and making sure that we were focused on the outcomes for students, not at the compliance side, but more at the academic achievement side of things.
Right. So So they're saying these ESE program facilitators were previously ESE liaisons. And at this point, we've asked for a current org chart because the org chart that is publicly available doesn't really explain all of these new positions or who they report up to or how it's going to work. But the ESE liaisons that are currently employed start school again, I think, next week. So maybe as this begins to roll out, we'll understand it a little better. And I'm sure they're all anxious to understand it a little better. But the important thing here is the fine print at the bottom. They're proposing replacing ESE compliance coordinators previously funded from the referendum funding with the ESE program facilitator positions. Is that clear to you, Susan?
No. And so we have on this slide, they're adding 9 ESE compliance coordinators, but then at the bottom, that same title says they're replacing them.
Right.
Yeah, that is not clear. I mean, genuinely, I have no idea what the duty, besides the titles, how are the duties changing, and are they? I'm actually have no idea what this means.
Well, and so it was interesting if you watch this, and I encourage people to watch this because I don't recall any board member asking any questions. And it's their responsibility to understand this because they have to vote on this. So if you're taking critical positions and potentially continuing to fund more of them through potentially non-recurring dollars, I find it difficult to believe that that's a priority in their mind with a 1 point something billion dollar budget.
Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, I think what resonated to me throughout this report that was presented was that there is a culture of distrust in this community, kind of at every level, that where they interviewed. And the recommendation that they made in order to reestablish trust was transparency and making sure people understood the how and the why of what we're doing. So when we have information and communication, that was another kind of thread. And so when we have slides like this that genuinely I hadn't really looked at until this morning when you showed it to me, I have not watched this workshop yet. I think that maybe they missed the call there.
So I agree with you. And I know that this isn't the focus of what we're talking about today, but if you could indulge me and show the next slide really quickly, then we could just show again a question about the school board's priorities. So here we have another slide about the literacy initiative. And we see people celebrating, as Susan so eloquently said, any gain is a celebration, but our third grade reading gain of 7% or something, we're still in the 60s for proficiency. And arguably that the number that they are using for proficiency is the 3s, 4s, and 5s. And by the FLDOE's own admission, 3s are not proficient. So
So tell people what you mean by 3s, 4s, and 5s.
As you rate the standardized assessments as the state grades them, students are put in buckets of 3s, which are they're
levels.
And 3s may require help in the next school year by the state's own admission. 4 is the number that is proficient, and 5s are mastery. So in Sarasota County, we have increased a little bit, and we're going to do a different podcast about reading, but it was big news, front page news, that we've increased, but we've still increased to less than 70% proficient, including the 3s, which are not proficient. So I say all of that to say that this is the literacy initiative that they all say they're so focused on. And this is what they're going to hire: the 41 literacy coaches and 25 literacy interventionists and 19 additional intensive reading teachers. But without seeing the school-based budgets, we can't see where these people are going and what they're doing. But the biggest concern out of all of this, again, is the fine print. They're proposing replacing funding of reading recovery program, which is not science of reading based, which we've used for years in Sarasota County, with literacy for all program in the referendum budget. So what does that tell you, Susan?
Well, again, I just worry about referendum dollars are not guaranteed dollars. And so if we're, you know, depending on dollars that could go away to fund this, what happens if the referendum dollars are no longer available? And you know, that's something that the citizens have to look at and make a decision of whether or not to allocate those tax dollars in addition to what's already collected.
Right. And I think that if we had a transparent budget to show us where that money was really going, because much like the budget we have currently, the budget book, which is a marketing piece, and we've got the strategic plan, which is a marketing piece, we're going to have a big marketing piece for this referendum. And it's almost scary to think, wow, if I vote no, what's going to happen to education? But we should be able to see how they're choosing to use the money they get before giving them more, in my opinion.
And we should see that the money that we're spending is giving us the desired outcomes we want for kids.
100%.
You know, I would pay them $2 million if every kid in Sarasota County could read.
Right. Or if we could go to a meeting and understand what curriculum they're using and not hear, oh, that's how we do it, instead of this is what this student needs. So
Right.
that's the story for the next podcast. But I just was a little bit shocked that there wasn't much discussion about this at the board level after they realized they have a problem. They requested outside help to talk about what's going on. And then they listened to the presentation of this report with not a lot of questions, although they had the one-on-one. So again, we don't know what was really discussed. But then they would allow the finance team to present two very important issues coming out of potentially money that won't be there. So I thought it was a little bit shocking.
So that's just like an update of what, because the report we're going through, again, is from November of 2023. So time has continued to march on. And the first set of recommendations were, they were encouraged to implement within the first 6 months after the report was received. Well, that time has now happened. We are 6 months later. We're actually more than 6 months later. So it's important to kind of, what did they choose to focus on and what didn't make the cut. So We'll try to continue to make updates about that as we learn them. It's just a lot of information for all of us to absorb. And so we're going to try to, you know, share it with you in bits and bytes as we go.
Right. So thanks for joining us, Random Detour. And we agree. We totally agree. The referendum dollars should not be tied to child literacy. Literacy should already be a goal that is baked into the cake of public education. So I think it's true. And if I could figure out how to display these comments, I will do it. But thanks for being here, Random Detour. So Susan, I think what we're starting with today is category 4, and it's programmatic offerings and the continuum of services. So that very first clip, and I don't think I can play them, that kind of tees it up with Todd talking to the board.
One of our concerns when we looked at MTSS, and I'm certain you all are familiar with the MTSS process. We have 3 tiers. Tier 1 is for students who are in our general all 3 are in general education populations. Tier 1 is about 80% of our students. They're receiving the general supports and services that you would expect to see in a little bit more support, new additional interventions, additional support services, whatever the case may be that those individual students might need. And of course, tier 3 is then if those tier 2 services are not sufficient, then we move on to tier 3 and provide some additional supports, some different supports to try to address those student needs. What we're seeing when we look around the district here is that MTSS tier 1 is operating just fine in this district. Tier 2, we have a tier 2 system, but it's not necessarily consistent. We see different types of tier 2 operations in different school buildings. Some places have a very robust tier 2 MTSS process in place. Others, it's virtually non-existent. And that inconsistency from one building to another is problematic. That should be something that's consistent throughout the district and something that all students are receiving. Now, when I say consistent throughout the district, I mean the level of service, not the individual services, just to be clear. When we move on to tier 3, there are places where, again, tier 3 does exist and is being utilized. There are also instances that we saw where tier 3 really isn't even existing in a meaningful way. We're moving from tier 2 to a recommendation for special education services. We're skipping out on that tier 3 altogether. That's problematic and troubling because that leaves that MTSS system with an entire hole in it that's really an important component for meeting the needs of those students. When we looked at MTSS and we looked at the Student Services Department, one of the things that we realized and one of the recommendations that we have to move them under the Chief Academic Officer is specifically related to this MTSS piece. And that is an academic piece. It is something that is important for the Chief Academic Officer to oversee. And it's something when we talk with staff at the Student Services Department, when they say no one here is overseeing MTSS, that's problematic in our minds. Someone does need to be overseeing MTSS, and it's something that needs to be happening on a regular basis. So that is one of our
Shocking.
So they went into great detail. Do you want me to switch to the actual report now and take a look at that, or do you have another clip you want us to listen to?
No, let's talk about the report. So, and while you're switching, I will say MTSS is a general education initiative. So as Todd said, this is tier 1 in the classrooms. All kids are getting this instruction. Now remember, on our board, we've got Karen Rose, who MTSS was in place when Karen Rose was employed here, RTI, MTSS. And she was the principal of a middle school and a director of all the middle schools, or executive director, I think, of all the middle schools on the superintendent's cabinet. And Robin Marinelli, who worked for the executive director of, at the time, Pupil Support Services, she was the director and she was in charge of implementing MTSS in this district. So at least 2 people are very, very familiar with this process.
So I'm not going to go through this because I think Todd did a pretty good job of focus area 141, going through it as he presented it to the school board. But just understanding that this is general education and 80% of students should be in tier 1 at any given time. We're going to have 20% of students that need something additional, and that's where they would move to tier 2. And then if that still isn't working, they would move to tier 3. And by tier 3, intervention should be very intensive and they should be individualized. And parents should be notified and understand what type of help their children are receiving, and is their child making progress? Is it helping to close the gap or remediate whatever it is that their child is struggling with? So it shouldn't be a surprise.
No, and it should be collaborative, and the teacher and the parent. If the parent says, I'm concerned about, often in the early grades, I'm concerned my child's a struggling reader. We have entire technology-based assessments that are done that they spend a lot of money on every year, that the teachers can drill down into the very specific components of the example I'm using is reading, to determine what part of reading is your child struggling in. And I will just say from our experience, we agree that they need more teacher training, because some of the things we hear in meetings do not follow the process we know to be MTSS.
And in this report, they say it should be evidence-based instruction, intervention, and assessment practices. Interventions are strategies or techniques used to teach a new skill, build fluency in a skill, or encourage the application of existing skills to a new situation. So I just think it's really important that parents and the community understand what the intent is, and that it should be student specific, and then include what you just talked about: targeted assessments, planning, data collection, and progress monitoring. So it's not a one and done. This is a whole process. And again, parents should be aware that it's happening, and they should understand what is occurring, and they should understand, is it helping their child?
In the meeting, it should be explained to you specifically what's happening, how often it's happening, and what progress your child's making. So what we find often is what they do in tier 1, they do more of in tier 2 sometimes, and then do it more intensely in tier 3, but it's the same thing that hasn't been working in tier 1. So that's
And you can see right here, they address that if an intervention is not a success, the teacher must analyze and choose an alternative intervention that may be a better fit for the student.
Mhm.
And it should be determined by data, and we should be continuously progress monitoring. And I think the other thing they address here is it should be a visual representation of the student. So not only are they supposed to collect the data, but they are supposed to graph it so that it's very visually clear to people looking at it. Where's the trend going for the student? Are they making progress or are they not? Is it flat? Are they hitting goals? I mean, it shouldn't be a guessing game. We should have information that we're basing our decisions on.
Right. And don't they compare them against their grade level peers as part of the progress monitoring?
They should. We
Mhm.
should be looking at, is the student, how are they doing? And not just against the children in their classroom, because sometimes we have all of the children in the bottom 25th percentile happen to all be in one class. So they're all sort of struggling learners. Well, we don't want to know just as how is your child doing compared to the other struggling learners. We want to know, compared to all their grade level peers in, let's say, third grade, how are they coming up to what the average third grader is able to do? Are they meeting proficiency based on the standards for the grade?
Right. And all of this should have happened before you get the call right before spring break that you've got concerns about your child in the statewide testing. That should never come as a surprise to any parent, ever.
The other thing that I thought was important in the report is that progress monitoring should be completed over a 6-week period, a minimum of 3 times throughout the school year. So again, to my point, this isn't a one and done. I mean,
Mhm.
we get sometimes the complaint from parents that my child's been in interventions for years and that they just keep getting stuck in the tiers and we don't actually remediate the problem. So that's a different issue that we have to deal with. But in this case, they're saying, you should make sure by continuously probing that this child is maintaining the growth that you saw when they were getting those intensive interventions. So if you back them off, is that child still continuing to acquire skills?
Right. And it shouldn't just be the progress monitoring that the state requires 3
So
times a year.
what they said was Sarasota has sought to develop a meaningful MTSS system. However, they are not always operating systematically or appropriately utilized by educators or staff members. Again, it's currently housed under student services, I know Todd said this, but I was just like, no one owns MTSS in Sarasota. How? I mean, seriously, how can that be?
Right.
right? Like every student in the county should be in tier 1.
Mhm.
And we have to, by regulation, use response to the interventions in MTSS to determine if a child has a disability. But if nobody owns it, how is there any fidelity or integrity in the data we're using to make decisions? That, I think that's what people need to understand, why we're so up in arms about.
Well, right. And Susan, the kids that have been coming to us in middle school and even high school recently, I think we see evidence of this. We see evidence of teachers recommending that this student is a struggling learner and begging for help, and they just basically get passed along to the next year. And it just is a repeat of it. So again, back to the what we had discussed previously, we've got a superintendent who's been here for about a year. And when we see the organizational chart, I think that will be helpful for us to determine if these recommendations are being followed, because somebody must own this and somebody must be accountable for this, or our achievement gaps aren't going to change.
Right. Yep. And so anyway, they just talked about how did they figure this out. They did classroom observations. They did interviews with district personnel. And that's how they determined that there's not a true MTSS framework in place. The personnel don't have a true understanding of MTSS or how it is utilized to support students. And again, we have watched this. This has been rolling out, I don't know, since 2005, 6. It's been, almost 20 years of us trying to implement MTSS in Sarasota County. This is not a brand new initiative. And that,
Well, it's not rocket science. It just isn't. And no matter how much word salad and edu-speak you want to throw at it, it is a process that makes sense and is part of our culture here. And how we're not doing it with fidelity when we say we care about every student every day is shocking.
so again, tier 2, not all teachers have a full understanding of what tier 2 is and how to implement it. And then when we get to tier 3, there should be more intense interventions, providing more targeted supports for students who continue to struggle. It is evident that tier 3 is not comprised of more intense interventions. Some teachers could not even define tier 3 interventions or explain the difference between tier 2 and tier 3. And what in Sarasota, if you say tier 3, that becomes synonymous with a referral to special education, which is not accurate. So obviously our MTSS,
Is that written in Sarasota? Tier 3 is synonymous with the referral to special education?
right there, highlighted in yellow in the middle of the page. Tier 3 is synonymous with a referral to special education.
Yeah, I agree. Random Detour is talking about data and how we should be using data to determine how many children receiving tier 3 should be expected to, close the gap rather than being referred to special ed. And that is one thing we do in Sarasota. We do it very well. We track data well. What we don't do well is share that data.
Well, and I'm not sure that we analyze it very well,
Right.
because if you're collecting data and you're not analyzing it to make changes and show improvement, what's the value in collecting it? And so I don't know how to answer Random Detour's question, because we don't even have integrity in the process. So even if we have the data and we try to analyze it, it's probably not an accurate reflection, because we're not really doing the tiers.
Right.
I have tiers right now.
Right. Oh my gosh. And I don't recall anybody discussing this at all other than what you just heard Todd discuss. So there
Right.
was no
Now,
conversation.
no
Mhm.
questions about this at the end of their presentation. Now,
Mhm.
again, we don't know what happened behind closed doors in the one-on-ones, but the public didn't get to hear this conversation that you and I are having.
Well, and I can recall a workshop a couple years ago, which included a teacher who has just resigned and left the district, and one of her assistant principals presenting to the board. And Brandon Johnson, is he still an executive director, Susan?
I think, is he elementary schools these days?
He was at this workshop that I'm thinking, and it was a school that talked about how they were structuring their classrooms and how they were using MTSS and how they had expected great growth in their students' reading scores. And I clearly remember the executive director saying, now we've done it at this school and we're going to emulate this throughout the district. And if he's still the executive director of middle schools, I would want to understand how we are, where we are with this report. And the same question for the executive director of student services. But it was shocking that we didn't have any of those conversations or look at or take a deeper dive into the data, because this impacts many kids every year that move here for our integrated schools.
They very clearly said what the deep dive was they were doing was ESE in this report, and that they did not do the deep dive into student services. But, looking at the numbers in Sarasota, that certainly might be worthy of another discussion at some point once they figure out if the recommendations here, can they implement them and are they helping?
Right. And replicate what's working and stop doing what doesn't work.
So one of the things that they, last point on this subject or this section, is that some schools have what they call an MTSS coordinator position, and it's a tremendous resource, and that Sarasota could utilize these coordinators to support in all school buildings throughout the district. So I think, again, that's back to the theme. One of the themes that I think emerged in this is that we need to make sure people on the front lines have support and coaching and mentoring and knowledge and training, and that there is a hierarchy within the district to make sure those things are happening. So the recommendation for 4.1 was establish a consistent district-wide framework defining MTSS tiers, how the tiers are utilized to provide interventions and support students, as well as the progression of students through the tier process, while holding teachers and staff accountable for implementing MTSS with fidelity through ownership and oversight by the Student Services Department, coupled with additional training and professional development. So kind of just what I said, that's the recommendation. All right, so then we move to focus area 4.2. And it is important for stakeholders, which they define as educators, parents, and community members, to understand the nature and design of the special education system. So do you have a clip for this one?
Well, I do have a clip. I'm not sure if right now is the time to play it, but
okay, well,
you go a little bit further, and I'll jump in when we could play it, because I think people need a little bit of background to understand what Todd delivers in his clip.
Okay. I'll keep talking, and you just jump in and shut me up when you want to.
All right.
Okay. So special education, and here I think this is so critical because lots of people who this isn't the world they're in don't understand that special education is a service. It is not a place for students with disabilities. It needs to change and adapt to meet the individualized need of the student, and there needs to be a continuum of services. And that means that we are going to utilize different service delivery models to provide individually designed instructional strategies to students. It is both the role and the obligation of Sarasota to provide services to a student in a manner and setting that meets their individual needs. So this continuum of services, just to put it in practical terms that people might know so they understand what a continuum is, general education with no supports and services, like you don't need any accommodations, would be the far end of the spectrum or the continuum. And then if you have a student with a disability that might just, they're okay, they can access the general ed curriculum, but they need some accommodations, they would have a 504 plan usually. Just to say this, we know this was a person with disability. In order to access their education, they need some accommodations. Then we have students that have actually IEPs. They are served in the general education classroom. They get accommodations. They will get perhaps some specially designed instruction from an ESE teacher that comes into the classroom, or maybe there's a co-teach model where there's 2 teachers in a classroom, or perhaps the classroom teacher is an ESE teacher, but they can deliver, they're duly certified. They can teach the gen ed curriculum and they can support their special ed kids, but the majority of the students in that class are not students with disabilities. Then we move to what they call a varying exceptionalities classroom or self-contained. All the students being served in that classroom are being taught by an ESE teacher, and all the students have disabilities. And then finally, for our most significantly disabled students, we have a center school in Sarasota called Oak Park. All the students who attend that school are students with disabilities. And by definition in federal law, 1% of students or less should need that very self-contained school where there's no non-disabled peers attending there. And then there's a few other options: hospital homebound for students who have like a chronic illness, or there could be a residential placement. A lot of times, I haven't seen that very often, but it's usually a student with significant mental health needs or behavioral needs that we would consider a placement like that. But that's what the continuum of services is, and that school districts need to think about, because they could have students that fall anywhere in that continuum.
And that would be a perfect place to play that next clip.
Okay.
Unless you had more.
Elementary years, in early elementary and in elementary school, we see very robust services. We see a lot of students who are getting their needs met. They're having individually very structured and individually designed services to get that. And they're getting those wonderful services throughout elementary school. And when those students go into middle school, the challenge there is that those students are being mainstreamed into full inclusion classrooms. There is no other option for middle school students other than to go into mainstreamed full inclusion in their middle school setting. The only option for that is to move students to Oak Park or to move them to other separate day schools outside of district. That's not okay. That is something that middle school students, for most cases, should be in their middle school classrooms, middle school building settings. We need to be able to provide the appropriate middle school services in those classrooms, because when those students move out of middle school into high school, those services are back, and we have that. We have a missing middle in that in that piece.
So that's shocking.
It is, and we're gonna I'm gonna finish up 4.2 real quick, and then I'm gonna move to 4.3 and really get into what we just heard about middle schools not having a continuum of services. So the bottom line in this focus area 4.2 is that we need to develop a student instructional model that provides a clear framework for establishing special ed as a continuum of services jointly developed by the district administration, building leaders, special ed teachers, and related service personnel, as well as outside expertise as needed. So let's move down to the next area of focus, 4.3, where they talk about the continuum of service has not been fully established, that we have significant gaps. And I just went through like the range that we have in our continuum. Best practice is to have students in the least restricted environment. So we want to be as close to that gen ed end of the continuum as is practical, as is appropriate for a student. What supports and services can we put in place so they can be with their non-disabled peers? But for some of our students, they have significant behavioral, academic, social needs that they may need instruction before they're able to gain benefit out of being in a gen ed classroom. And for some of our really significantly needy students, they may, you know, gen ed may never be appropriate for them. And so we need to make sure that we can serve all the students that come through our doors.
Well, and appropriately serve them. So if we don't do the tiers of intervention appropriately and remediate gaps that we could remediate with good instruction or different instruction, what we're doing is passing students along, growing gaps, and that leads to behavior issues that we've got that are sometimes not served well, I will say.
Yes. And so as many individual students as we have, that's how many individual like unique situations we run into. And we need to have appropriate educational options for all of our kids. And we need to make sure if we have opportunities in order to remediate or mitigate or provide new skills for our students, we're doing that as early in their education career as we can, because we all know that early intervention has a tremendous impact on student outcomes as they move through life.
Yes.
So 4.3, this section, reestablish limited self-contained classrooms in strategically targeted locations throughout the district to serve students who need a self-contained environment to most appropriately meet their individual needs. And I will say, I'm sorry, one thing, that the team that looked at this did celebrate that Sarasota really did try to put inclusion options in place for our kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I will tell you, we do work in other districts and we see times where special ed is still thought of as a place.
Yes.
Where can we put that student? And in a lot of the meetings we sit in Sarasota, that is not, that mentality has changed. It's evolved. We do think about how can special ed kids be in regular ed classrooms. We just still have work to do. And I think we'll always have work to do to meet the unique needs of the student and make sure we're offering a continuum that serves all students.
Right. Well, and the other side of that coin, although we do that well, what we don't offer is a place for, if you've been in self-contained throughout your elementary career, you can't just go into gen ed in middle school and expect these students to be successful. And we hear it from teachers, we hear it from parents. So taking a hard look at that, and I do know some parents are waiting for answers from the district about what middle school is going to look like this year. And to my knowledge, they haven't gotten those answers.
And so that's right where we are in the report, where they've identified that there's one notable exception in Sarasota, and that is middle school. Transition to middle school for special education students in Sarasota is at best difficult and at worst detrimental to the student's development. There is no continuum of services for middle school. And so again, they talk all about elementary, what you just said, and then the supports just disappear when the student moves into the middle school. And how many families have we talked to and they're in 5th grade and they're like, what are we going to do?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, what they're looking at now is, what are the private options? Can I homeschool? Could we do Florida virtual school? I mean, they're trying everything they can to avoid the middle school environment because they know that their child isn't going to be successful because there's no supports and services that are appropriate already that exist there.
Well, and oftentimes the parents don't know that until they go to middle school, because what they're told by school staff is, this is what we do, they'll be fine, don't worry.
Mm-hmm.
And when the parents come to us, things have gone south and some parents have a lot to worry about.
So again, they're reiterating that while most special needs students should and can receive education and supports in a traditional middle school setting, having only one choice for integration into middle school mainstreaming and to full inclusion just isn't acceptable.
Mhm.
And so for students to receive more intense behavioral support if needed, they're kind of the only choices to look at Oak Park, which we've already talked about as a very restrictive setting, or an out of district comprehensive day school. And it's not appropriate for a majority of students. I just want to remind everybody that the federal standard for special education is a free, appropriate public education.
Mhm.
So when we're not offering this, we are not in compliance with federal law.
Well, and how many calls do we get every year from parents that alternative schools are sold as Disneyland and their children are being transferred there, which used to be a transparent process in Sarasota. We could see how many students were being transferred to alternative schools. And that alternative school was full very early last year.
And so when a student has a significant behavioral issue, one of the options that parents are given rather than expulsion is a transfer to an alternate school. And so that's what you're talking about, right?
Yes.
Okay. So to end this section, recommendation 4.4 is to reconfigure special ed in Sarasota's middle schools to include a continuum of services that provide an appropriate classroom setting for all students with special needs and deliver the supports needed for students to transition and thrive during their middle school years. And I will tell you, I mean, there's a lot in this report that I agree with, but this one is like, it should have like stars around it. I mean, it should be flashing because it is such a dire, urgent, emergent need for our
Mhm.
kids.
Mhm.
I like, I mean, we need our kids to read. We need all of our children to be able to read and do math and write. But these middle school kids, this is life altering when they go to a place that is not appropriate for them.
Well, and what we've heard a lot of talk about growing cluster sites in throughout Sarasota County, and that's happening for the upcoming year. But again, without seeing any budgets and without seeing the details, we don't know if this is going to happen this year or if this is not being considered.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of scary that today is 7/11. I mean, school starts in about a month and we still don't know what does the continuum look like in middle schools.
Mhm. Or the cluster sites that they're adding. So there's a lot we need to understand better, and hopefully that will be transparent as they say they are.
Okay, do you want to move to the next section or do you have more input?
Nope, I think if you want to play that next clip, that would be helpful at this point.
Is it this one?
It's the third one.
Okay.
Anything that people don't know. But the point is, we have to know how to deal with the customers up front so that we don't necessarily have to have that kind of an outcome. Recommendation 5.1B is to eliminate the practice of predetermination of placement to alleviate a violation of free appropriate public education. So let's talk about that. Nobody intentionally makes a predetermination, but when we have meetings, sidebar meetings, or that we don't think we have a place for a student to go and we haven't made those decisions at the IEP table, then we're predetermining. And we cannot meet the needs of every child at every school. There has to be options on that continuum that Todd talked about. But that predetermination is probably one of the biggest violations that a district can make in terms of free appropriate public education. And that has to be eliminated. We have to discontinue the practice of misidentifying students to avoid that EBD label, educally behaviorally disturbed. So let's talk about emotionally behavior disturbed, So let's talk about that. every district in the state of Florida has rules that they have to follow, and we have to look at disproportionality. And Sarasota, not uncommon to other districts in the state of Florida, had an issue at one time with disproportionality. But the fact that you have that issue and it takes you a while to rectify it doesn't mean that you then decide not to label students appropriately if they are emotionally behaviorally disturbed and they meet that eligibility criteria. This process has to be reviewed and evaluated. The IEP and the placement of OHI and your other health impaired, and then your ASD, your autism spectrum students, are currently being served in EBD settings. What that says is that uncharacteristically, you have a very low number of EBD students because we're not identifying them, and you have a very high number of other health impaired with a close second on ASD. If you look at the chart that's up here on the board, these are the number of EBD students per cluster school. You have 8 cluster schools, and the highest number of any EBD population in any of those schools is at Northport with 22. But it seems a little out of sync when you look at the other numbers and you know that you have cluster sites that should be serving that. Now, there are other populations of students that do have behavior issues. So I'm not going to sit here and say that maybe, there are students in those units that shouldn't be. But when you walk into a unit that's specifically for EBD students and you see either 0 EBD students or all ASD students, and maybe a mix of OHI, there's something that's not right in that process. If we don't need that many EBD units and we just need behavioral processes, that's different. The other thing that's impacted in this process is the student's IEP. What an ASD student needs to manage their behavior and their curriculum is very different than what a student with emotional problems needs in their curriculum and their unit. So that's a hard look at something that has to change as we go forward in time. Thank you.
Susan, I didn't quite know how to stop you on that one, but that was kind of the meat and potatoes of this.
Yeah.
There was a different clip that might have kicked this off. So I don't know how you want to do that.
So do you want me to go back to the other clip?
No, I think we could just talk about this starting. I just want you to know there was
Okay. So everybody who's listening, or, random detour, we're still getting down the whole technology piece of this. And so I'm going to just jump into this category 5 as policies and procedures.
Yep.
And the first focus area of this was that federal law, IDEA, guides the special education process. And again, back to what I said, free and appropriate public education, FAPE, in the least restrictive environment, LRE is what it's known as. Lots of acronyms in special education for anybody that hadn't noticed that. Every decision a district makes related to special ed students must be aligned with IDEA and in compliance. So to be in compliance with the federal law is mandatory. And if we don't do, the reason we worry about compliance is because if we are compliant, then we are serving students appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we always laugh when we go to a meeting and they follow the rules. It's like we have a great outcome.
Yep.
Because the rules are designed so that we have a good outcome. So under IDEA, when There's a request to consider the placement of a student in special education that comes, it doesn't matter who asks, whether it's the teacher, some other personnel in the school, a parent, there's an evaluation process that must occur. Data is collected about the student, and it's not limited to just academic behavior and social emotional data. They really have to look at the whole child. We need to consider everything that's going on with that student. We do a social history. We look at what is that student's background? What is their living situation? Have they been through any traumas? I mean, we should be looking at everything that impacts how this child is able to learn.
Right. Did the child just come here from somewhere else and isn't English speaking? There's so many factors that play into how to help a child be successful in school.
So IDEA provides a process for making determinations in educationally appropriate ways. It is intended to create and you saw that I highlighted this, a partnership among schools, districts, and parents to determine if the student needs special education services by examining a plethora of data. So you can't look at one piece of information and make a decision. You're supposed to look across the child's all of their environments. How do they do in school? How do they do at home? How do they do in the community? And have lots of different data and input and viewpoints as we're making decisions for the child. The goal of any district special education system must be to protect the rights of children with disabilities and their families, and to improve student outcomes through the delivery of special education and related services, and having high expectations for the students and meaningfully including them alongside their non-disabled peers as appropriate. So that's back to that continuum of services we just talked about. Without defined roles and responsibilities and procedures to assure compliance, it's impossible to assure compliance without those things. Procedural compliance without a focus on outcomes is not compliance with IDEA. Like,
Right.
that is a huge statement. I know it's buried in the middle of this, but that's really the nuts and bolts of all of this. If you're in compliance without worrying about are the children making progress, what difference does it make? And you're not meeting what the law intended.
Right. So just because you check the box and you say you're compliant, you're not. And maybe, where are you? I'm just
right.
Yeah.
Yep. Use of ideas, procedures to ensure delivery of effective instructional practices, supports, and service that most impact results and protects the rights of students and their parents. And I just think, I'm not sure people who don't have kids in special ed necessarily know that protection of rights is such a centerpiece of this law, and making sure that kids are treated without discrimination, that they have access to education, and as their parents are advocating for their needs, that they are also have rights that shouldn't be trampled.
Right. Well, and we've talked about this numerous times, that the largest population of students with special needs are students with average or higher IQs that learn differently. Maybe it's dyslexia, maybe it's some kind of math disability, specific learning disability, but these are very capable students who just need to be taught differently. And maybe, Susan, if you play that clip right before the one you just played, that would lead us into this section.
It's not anything that people don't know. But the point is, we have to know how to deal with the customers up front so that we don't necessarily have to have that kind of an outcome. Recommendation 5.1B is to eliminate the practice of predetermined.
We already played that clip.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, then fire me. I didn't do my job right.
Okay, so I'm sorry.
Let's just keep going.
Okay. So here's something I think that probably is near and dear to Sue and I, and we want to talk in a little more detail, maybe even than the report gives, because I know that this section of the report is not accurate. So let me just read what it says here, and then let's talk about what really happened.
Ooh, I thought you were saving it for another day.
Well, I just want to do a short, like the reference in case people want to go look it up.
Okay.
Sarasota, like many school districts throughout the nation, has had their share of audits due to due process hearings, resolutions, and settlements. Most recently, case number 19633-8E involved multiple violations that impeded a child's right to faith. Issues addressed include, but are not limited to, student placement, modified alternative curricula, and specialized needs, participation in and appropriateness of IEP, mental health counseling, as well as compensatory education and extended school year. On March 27, 2020, the administrative law judge from the Division of Administrative Hearings issued a final order directing Sarasota to convene an IEP and rectify the issues. Subsequently, on December 8, 2020, the Commissioner of Education, Richard Corcoran, sent correspondence to the then Superintendent, Dr. Brennan Asplin, and the former board chair, Shirley Brown, noting that the Inspector General had concluded their investigation, stating, so the first part, they say that they didn't find any evidence that they made these, they did these things because they were trying to benefit financially. But they go on to say, pursuant to the investigation, the district made inconsistent decisions for several years that directly impacted numerous students with special needs. The investigation found that 27 of 66 sampled student files either showed the students were improperly placed or contained insufficient documentation to demonstrate that the student was placed incorrectly. As such, I am ordering my staff to commence regular on-site monitoring of the Sarasota County School District's ESE services until such time that we are either satisfied that the district has implemented a system of appropriate services and placements, or financial consequences become necessary due to persisting failures by the district. All right, I know that was a lot, and I have a fair amount of things that I'd like to say about this. I want to start with, without going into any detail, to say Sue and I were involved in the case that is referenced here. We were advocates for the family. This family was in the situation where they had to file a due process claim against the school district twice. And the case that's referenced here is actually the second case. But the violations that are outlined in this paragraph happened in the first case, the initial case that was filed. So if you are interested in reading about this case, if you go to the Department of Administrative Hearings, or DOAH, D-O-A-H, and you look up case number 19-633-AE, it will, in that case, say this is part 2, Sarasota 2. Sarasota 1 has a different case number, and it was the ruling that really listed out a lot of the problems that this paragraph talks about. And then, but after the second due process, which was this case they referenced there, and the order was issued on March 27th, there was follow-up from the FLDOE, from the Commissioner of Education, and this Inspector General's report. Sue, before I move past that, you have anything that you want to add into what I just said?
Well, I want to see where you're going first. So why don't you just keep going, and
Okay, so the second thing I want to say is there was the Inspector General's report did trigger monitoring of Sarasota County. And since the time that that happened, whatever the Florida Department of Education required Sarasota to do, they did those things sufficiently to the place where the FDOE removed the monitoring. They have since been released from monitoring. The reason I bring this up is, that happened when I'm going to scroll down to see if they tell us what date. On May 11th of 2022, the FDOE staff has reviewed the documentation from Sarasota, assurances that necessary portions of the funding were going to training and support activity that will create sustainable changes. And they found as evidence of positive progress in Sarasota's implementation of a comprehensive system that provides appropriate services and placements for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. And all I want to say is that was done May 11th of 2022. The report we're reading was done November 28th of 2023. And even though it wasn't zeroed in specifically to this one issue of students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, I think it is important to note that this report still outlines that we have significant problems in how ESE is being administered in Sarasota. And so the focus of what FDOE chose to monitor was very, very narrow compared to the problems that these two cases brought to light, and that we know happened in Sarasota and also in many other counties throughout Florida. So if parents are relying on, well, the FDOE, came in and they took a look and they monitored and everything's okay, I would say there are still concerns and we need to still keep paying attention.
Well, and we often say that. We often say it's the fox guarding the hen house. I remember a time when we could call up to the state and the state would make a phone call to the district and we would collaboratively fix things.
Yep.
And things have really changed. What I wanted to add here, Susan, is remember, and we have never told our story publicly at all.
Nope.
The most public we was in the newspaper during the course of the time that this case was going on. And I think, what is our website, Susan, if people are interested?
Our website is IEP4FOR parents.com.
So in there, you can see both rulings by the administrative law judge. And there was a historical sequence of events that was outlined in the newspaper at the time. There was a different reporter here with our local newspaper, and he was very interested in this. And I think did an amazing job understanding it and drilling down the details. But what I found interesting is they did not discuss the first case. And the two things that are not discussed that we prevailed in the first case, one was predetermination, and the second was deliberate indifference. So, Susan, why don't you explain what deliberate indifference is?
Deliberate indifference means that the actions that were harmful to the student that were identified through the court case were done intentionally, that there was knowledge that they were happening and that they continued. And so we were able to show through the evidence that was presented and the testimony that was provided to the administrative law judge that they knew the problem existed, they knew it was harmful to the student, and they continued.
So it's a bar higher than negligence. And
Correct.
in predetermination, was also intentional. And I think as you'll see, we're gonna discuss this further in this report. So as you said, they did oversight over a very narrow section, which was also a very interesting process that we'll discuss at a different podcast. But moving forward, just because you check the box does not mean you're compliant. And that's something parents need to remember. So when you're told this is what's happening and you feel like there might be something not right, dig a little deeper. And the only other thing I'd like to say is we've been doing advocacy for many, many years, always very, very collaboratively. Nobody wants to sue their school district. Nobody wants to fight. But you do get one chance to educate your child, and you need to take it very seriously, because oftentimes the outcomes that we see are devastating to families if that's not taken seriously.
So I'm gonna pop back to the report. And I'm gonna jump in here where it says the district has trained ESE liaisons, program specialists, and ESE assistant principals, yet it is evident that there is a lack of consistency, not only with the documented processes and procedures, but also in the development of the IEP. Inconsistency frustrates all participants, especially parents, and boy, do we see that when they call us, impacts knowledge and understanding, and causes unnecessary tension. Parent communication is core and essential to the IEP development process. Parents are customers and should be treated as such in IEP meetings. It is imperative parents understand the various aspects and processes and fully participate as a member of the IEP team. Staff should be trained on de-escalation techniques to ensure that meetings are conducted in a professional manner, and to make certain parents are viewed as equal partners in the decision-making process for their child. I think everybody needs to reread that paragraph. Parents are equal partners. Parents should be treated, and as much as I agree that they should be treated as customers of the system, there are also stakeholders in the system, and they are the only person in a child's life who aren't a drive-by. They have the whole view of that child, and the knowledge of that individual child that they bring to the table is so valuable. I don't know how you can make decisions without understanding the parent's perspective on how the child learns and what they need.
Right. So if the parents see their child struggling at home, it's infuriating when you go to a school meeting and they're like, oh no, he's doing fine here. He just isn't trying.
Yeah.
So things like that need to stop.
So they conducted interviews on site. They did some random samplings of IEPs and student data. They looked at IEP goals and objectives, and is data appropriate? In some cases, ESE liaisons were instructed to reflect the school program, not the child's needs. Students' IEPs are developed, they found, without all the appropriate diagnostic information. They've improperly identified specific programs. They weren't drafted correctly or accurately. Some sections had even been cut and pasted from one IEP to the other. And they even had some IEPs where they found a different student's name was used throughout various places in the document. And certainly, we've seen that where the student we're talking about, the name that's in the document isn't theirs. An IEP is a legal document. It should be accurate, comprehensive, and developed in accordance with federal law. And we need to make sure our staff members are trained on proper development.
Right. There's clear process. So when you talk about an eligibility category, it's not just do we think that maybe? There are boxes that need to be checked and data that needs to be gathered, and there's very clear criteria of eligibility and clear indication of how you develop an IEP for a child that needs to be an individual education plan, not just what we offer in this program. So I think they did a really good job explaining all of that.
I agree.
Mhm.
The next section is where they're talking about the EBD problem, and that we have students who are misidentified perhaps as other health impaired or as autism spectrum disorder, but really their primary disability should be EBD, and how those students are not maybe in the right programs, or their IEPs are not appropriate for their actual needs. And I'm not going to go through this in too much depth because I think the clip really explained it well. They one thing that
But the pages that we're looking at and the charts that we see, is that where you're going?
I am.
Okay.
One thing I wanted to point out, though, is for other health impaired students, which a lot of times is a student with ADHD, they say here maybe there's a lack of consideration for a Section 504 plan, and they've gone right to OHI. And I just wanted to say, if a student only needs accommodations in order to access their education, and they don't need any kind of special instruction, then a 504 plan would be appropriate. What I see is a lot of times our ADHD students, especially when they're younger, they need some specially designed instruction to help them understand executive function needs, how to organize, how to plan, how to manage their time. If they get those tools, those skills, then a lot of times as they become older, we can just look at accommodations to help with things because the underlying skill has been remediated. So I just think we need to, although I agree with them, we may not do enough with 504 plans. I think it's a slippery slope that we need to be careful that we make sure that the students have the skills they need and that accommodations are really enough.
Well, and that was the whole boondoggle that Mrs. Marinelli was talking about with
Correct.
Section 504 in Sarasota. And when they sold this proposal, they were going to dive deep into it. But I think this is as deep as we dive.
Right. And I would say that 504s currently live under the student services umbrella. And so perhaps some of why they didn't get into 504 very deeply is because it wasn't really under the ESE department.
I understand that. But if you remember how they sold this, Robin made a big deal about.
I understand, but my point is she knows where it's housed.
Right.
So then do you want to talk about this first chart?
Sure.
I made it a little bit bigger.
I think this goes back to the original conversation that we had about disproportionality in identifying students with EBD. And that was when we did that indicator podcast, Susan, do you recall what our numbers were?
I don't remember, but I know that no, I don't. They were looking at discipline and disproportionality of discipline. And I don't remember exactly what the number was, but I know our Black students were disproportionately being disciplined.
Currently.
Yes.
Right. So what this chart is showing us is the breakdown of eligibilities within the categories that students can qualify for special education. So what it's telling us is speech impaired and language impaired are the biggest percentage at 31.8%. And then we have SLD students, which again are students with a specific learning disability. Maybe it's dyslexia, maybe it's dyscalculia, maybe it's not defined, it's just an SLD. that they require specially designed instruction to close the gap and achieve the goals that we've developed in the IEP. Students on the autism spectrum are 13.8% of the population of special education students in Sarasota, OHI being 13.5. DD is developmentally delayed. That age group has recently increased to also incorporate students up to, is it age 9 now, Susan?
Right. It used to be, it ended by the time the child's 6th birthday, they had to be, if they still had a disability, they could no longer just go under the broad category of developmentally delayed. And now we've extended that to age 9, that it's their 9th birthday. They have to be one of these other categories if they're still showing that they're a child with a disability.
Students in Sarasota who have an intellectual disability are only 4.5% of the population. EBD is 1.9% and other 2.1. So do you want to go into the breakdown of those to help people understand or not?
We can just tell them what these letters stand for. So DHH is deaf, hard of hearing. OI is orthopedically impaired. VI is visually impaired. TBI is traumatic brain injury. And what is dual sensory impaired, DSI, usually like a deaf blind student.
Mm-hmm.
And we have very, very few students. I don't know that I've ever worked with a family whose student is deaf blind.
So if you look at this, over 50% of our students are either a specific learning disability or speech impaired or language impaired.
And it's important to know that most of those kids, all the kids with SLD and most of the kids with speech impaired or language impaired are going to have an average IQ. So this chart they talked about in the clip we played, that the number of EBD students at cluster sites across the district. And so I don't think we need to go through that again. So again, compliance shouldn't only be processes and procedures, but that are defined and implemented, but they should also be followed. I thought that was interesting. There is somebody who attends meetings that they're known as the LEA, the Local Education Agency Representative. That person should be qualified to provide or supervise the provision of specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of the student with disabilities, knowledge about the education curriculum, and knowledge about the availability of resources of the public agency. So what that means in practical terms for families is somebody in your child's IEP meeting, when you're trying to write the document, should have all of these, should know all of these things. They should know what curriculums do we have available, what resources do we have. They should be able to commit those resources. You shouldn't be able to say, well, we don't know if we can do that here. Somebody should have answers in that meeting or be able to get the right answers.
And you can ask, who's the LEA? And ask for them to either approve it or not approve it, but that's another podcast for a different day.
And so they should have knowledge, they should have special ed background, they should have the knowledge they need of special education. And if it's an administrator, a lot of times it's an assistant principal that fills that role here. They may need additional training to make sure that they know all those things we expect of them. They should be running the meeting and have knowledge of the legal aspects of the federal law and the authority to allocate resources. The U.S. Supreme Court has referred to the IEP as the centerpiece or the modus operandi for ensuring the provision of FAPE for students. So there were 2 landmark cases that are referred to often. The first is the Rowley case. And the second one, I know here it says Andrew F, but it's actually Andrew F. It's with an E. Anybody's trying to look it up, versus the Douglas County School District. They're the driving force behind what they call the twofold process content standard for determining FAPE. So the first is procedurally, did they comply? Did they follow the procedures outlined in IDEA? And if they did, then the second piece is, was the IEP reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress in light of the child's circumstances? Was the content of it appropriate? Anything you want to add there?
No, but could you please just scroll up so we can follow along with where you're reading?
I'm right here. First and second. That's what I just read.
Oh, on my screen, it's showing the chart still. Sorry, I must be frozen.
Oh, it shows that I'm on the report. I hope for the public, that's what it shows. It's what it shows on my screen. So the purpose of an IEP meeting is for a team to meet, establish the goals, academic, behavioral, to be successful, determine the supports, accommodations, and strategies that a student needs to meet those goals, and then develop a document that identifies the supports and interventions. All relevant student records, data, and anecdotal records should be available. And sometimes we have found that getting records is a challenge. And it's very difficult to be an equal member of an IEP team if you don't have access to the educational records that everybody's using to make decisions. Evaluations and reevals. So in IDEA, every 3 years, you must consider, does the child need any updated evaluation so that you're writing the appropriate IEP. They must be up to date, thorough, and adequate. The present level of functioning, so how is the student doing right now, is a significant piece of the IEP. It must reflect the child's current strengths and challenges. You need baselines established so that you can measure the progress over the course of the year. Sarasota indicate that often student records and/or medical information are not available or transferred in a timely manner, which impacts the efficacy of the decision-making process and ultimately the IEP. In some cases, IEPs were developed in Sarasota that had old or recycled data. This procedure is unacceptable. It is not in the best interest of our students or parents that the district serves. So then we get to, and I know this has been going on like a long time. I feel like I've been talking forever, but we're at the place of predetermination. And you'll remember we heard Dr. Lockman say, this is one of the most serious violations that can happen against federal law. And it is a place of concern in Sarasota. Without parental input or outside of the IEP meeting or placement meeting, decisions are being made, and it causes parents to lose trust. And it's a denial of FAPE. When the decisions are made outside the meeting, then the child is not receiving FAPE. It's an area of concern. And students being transferred to a separate day school or a cluster site, the parent must be involved in that decision-making process. And actually, when a student is being considered to go to a center school like Oak Park, the parent in Florida, and this is a Florida state law, not a federal law, must give permission. They must give consent before the child can be moved to that most restrictive placement. In some cases, the report goes on to say, a decision is being made at the sending site, so the school the student is attending, and or with district personnel without the input of the receiving site, the school they want to send the student to, without conducting a site visit or preliminary discussion with the receiving school and or the parent. Ultimately, the IEP is developed, yet in many cases, the placement is not appropriate nor in the student's best interest. And so I think that is what, we're talking about, that we need to make sure that the student's parent is part of this decision-making process. Prior to the IEP team determining placement, administrators of the potential sending schools, so the school your child's currently attending, need to understand the program, the student population, and the services that are being provided at cluster sites or separate day schools. And in some cases, the folks from that more restrictive environment, it may not be may not be appropriate, but if we're considering it, then the team members from that school should come to the IEP meeting, and everybody should be open and receptive. Open-minded and receptive and responsive to the constituents. Secondly, recommendations for special education services are sometimes made based upon the availability of programs or services rather than upon a student's needs. So it's like we go to a meeting and somebody says, well, what time can somebody do that? It's not what does the student need, it's what do we have and who can do it. So that is not how the process is intended to work. Decisions should be based on the individual needs of the student. It's very clear in federal law that availability of services cannot be a deterrent to making a service recommendation, and ultimately could be perceived as a form of predetermination of the placement. So one of the things we've heard is a principal go, I don't have the budget for that. That kid might need a paraprofessional with them, but we don't have any staff available, so we can't do it. Those kind of things are not appropriate and shouldn't happen in IEP meetings. Go ahead.
Yeah, it should never be about funding or money, and we often remind the teams of that when we're in meetings with them.
Sarasota, like many districts throughout the U.S., they've had staffing shortages. It is evident the district demonstrates a pattern of shifting personnel to assist in other areas and or staff utilization in non-licensed areas that interfere with service provisions determined by the IEP team. These situations make it difficult and ultimately impossible for personnel to reschedule missed sessions. This is a potential violation of IDEA and is viewed as non-compliant and could ultimately be detrimental to Sarasota's reputation as a district and a service provider. This is a very long section. We're working our way through it.
And anytime you want to play that last clip, Susan, the last clip goes through recommendations B, C, and D, and it's just her recap of it. But
okay, well, let's go there. Let's see what
is to make sure that we have oversight and supervision for our BCBAs, our behavior personnel. BCBAs have a tough job, and they are hard to retain. So as we continue to support them and encourage them to stay with the district, to supervise them, and to give them adequate support and ongoing training, whether that be through maintaining the personnel we have or encouraging personnel that we have maybe to go and get their certification as a BCBA. They know our kids, so why wouldn't we invest in them and train them to become BCBAs? And if that doesn't work, then districts have gone to outsourcing. And they sometimes can find the numbers to meet their level of expectation for that population. So I think it's very important with the growing demands of this district. It's not going to get smaller. It's growing every day. Those are considerations that you need to make. School-based and district administrators and Oak Park. So that's recommendation 5.1D. This is one thing that was a big aha for us. Not shocking, but a big aha, that we have school-based administrators out there and throughout the district that think they know what happens at Oak Park. They have one concept of what that is. They also think they know what a cluster site looks like at their neighboring school. Student doesn't fit in my school, so he must have to go to Oak Park. Student doesn't fit in my school, he must have to go to a behavior cluster. Our recommendation is that administrators need to be required, and I know we can't always require, but required, yes, you can, sir. Thank you. I can't, you can. Yes, sir. There you go. To visit Oak Park, not just to do a walkthrough, live and breathe in Oak Park for a few hours a day. Live and breathe in that cluster unit that's at my neighbor's school to see whether or not the kid I'm getting ready to say, no, he needs to go there, really needs to go there. And have we gone that extra mile in our school to meet that student's behavioral issues? That is core and essential. And I appreciate the superintendent's support because I think that it will change the face of how we're placing students in units more appropriately. 5.2, you have a strong asset in this district called a pre-K diagnostic team. We've had an opportunity to talk to some of them and to look at the value that they bring to the district. But we think that role should be expanded with a more permanent team here at the central office to handle those out-of-state and out-of-county transfers, to deal with those private school evaluations, those difficult-to-test students, and to eliminate those partial documents going from here to the school. If you could establish a system here to take on that population and reduce the numbers that the school-based evaluation caseloads have to take on, then I think you would have a win-win situation because everything would come in one package to Ms. Marinelli's school. They would be ready to staff and they would be ready to place. In addition to that, the appropriate people are available in one location to do those kind of outside processes, and the school would only be dealing with those kids that actually come through an MTSS process or need to do reevaluations.
Okay, so I think we are very close to the end of the two sections that we wanted to review. And so,
Well,
just go ahead.
oh, you are at 46. I was going to say just that last paragraph. I think the self-reporting of staff, and whether it be at school level or district level, expressing concern to the people that were reviewing the program, begging, saying, we've got issues. We've got issues with compliance. We've got issues regarding questionable service delivery and minutes, accurate documentation, methodologies, and lack of attendance at meetings. It's evident that insufficient staffing and lack of personnel supervision are impacting the provisions of FAPE. That's what they're tasked with doing, delivering FAPE.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to switch back to us just for a minute because that, what you just read and then what Dr. Lockman shared with the board was the end of section 5, category 5, which is where we're going to end today. I know that this was long and deep and a little dry maybe, and nuts and bolts technical for people. But when we go to meetings with families in order to try to get appropriate services in place for their child, all of these nuts and bolts have to line up. If we don't follow procedures, if we don't have the right personnel, if we don't have the right people at the table, if we don't have the right information and data that we're considering, if we don't have people who understand what it means and can interpret it and analyze it and turn it into a plan for a child, and then people at the school who know how to read that plan and implement it and keep data on it and analyze that data. And I mean, it's really a cycle and a circle because we start with a plan, we implement the plan, we measure the success of the plan, and then we come back the next year and we have to write a new plan. And it should be based on what we learned over the course of the last year. And it incorporates the perspectives of all the people who come to the table that are part of that child's life. And if we do it well, what we should see is a child in light of their circumstances who continues to make progress. And remember, the purpose of the federal special education law is to prepare our children for post-secondary education, for employment, and for independent living. And so every time our teams convene, that is the lens we should be looking for, whether they're 5 years old and they're in kindergarten or they're 18-year-olds that are getting ready to either exit high school or go on into an 18 to 22-year-old program in the schools. Are we preparing our students with the skills that they need to move into adult life?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't know if she touched on her very last recommendation, but she's talking about realigning our existing ESE procedures and ESE transfer student checklist. And those things are really important because had a huge influx of people moving here. And if we don't start with a good baseline, we can never get to do any of the things that you just expounded on. And these families that come, that get to us, that we hear from all the time in the past couple of years, they moved here and their IEPs are decimated. So they have to rewind before they can start. And those practices have to stop in Sarasota.
Right, which is why I think she recommended a separate diagnostic team at the district level to really look at these transfer students, because federal law requires that while Florida looks at, does this child meet the definition of having a disability and which programs are they eligible under Florida statute, they need to provide comparable services to the IEP the student is coming to us with from whatever state they're moving here from. And so I think what Sue is saying is we've had families that have contacted us and they've come with what they thought was a really solid IEP from whatever state. They've arrived here and it either hasn't been implemented at all, or they've been told we don't do that here, and their child just doesn't get the service that they need. So we need to make sure, one, the day the child gets here, that they are appropriately supported in order to have a good transition to Sarasota. And then two, if there's additional information we need to gather, that we do it efficiently and quickly to get this child settled and meeting with success in this new environment.
Yeah, I think everything they've outlined in these two sections is so relevant and important and needs to be taken very seriously. And as we said, this superintendent, he inherited a lot of this stuff. But this board giving him a long-term contract needs to become transparent, identify these problems, and look into the nuts and bolts of how he's going to resolve these things, because it's impacting lives.
And they really need to remember that the stakeholder group includes families and the community. This is a very educated, interested, supportive community that we live in Sarasota. And I know for some superintendents, they're like, wow, they're like almost over interested. But
Yeah.
we are fortunate that people care about kids, whether even if they don't have kids in this district, we have lots of people that care about our schools and our students.
Mhm.
And they need to understand the process and the priorities and how we're going to improve student outcomes.
I agree. And the blame shift has to stop and the transparency has to start. So I think working together as a community collaboratively is where we need to get to, but the school district is has to move the needle a little bit to to back to being a partner in two-way communication and admitting that some of these things are real and working together with how to fix them.
And I really think that this report, if they take it seriously and they look to implement solutions based on the feedback that's in here, it is pretty representative of a lot of the things that we know to be true over
Mhm.
the years of working here. And I think this is a real opportunity to realign things, to improve for our staff, for our kids, for our families. And I genuinely hope that this new administration, as they're moving into their second year, um, works together with their stakeholders to implement the things that are necessary for our kids to move forward.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I think as soon as we see what the current um, organizational chart looks like, and if they are forthcoming with the budget, so we can see the trends and where they're spending money and what these clusters are going to look like. We're working with parents right now that are waiting to get questions answered. So hopefully, all the everything starts lining up quickly here.
So this was a long, long chat today, but again, really important topics, and they're important because at the end of the day, they impact our children.
Well, thanks so much, Susan, for carrying that weight and for getting me through my technological errors and my freezing and my wrong clips. And I think I
It,
need an RMP.
it's all good. Thanks again, and we will see you next week. Bye.
See you soon.